Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Election Tricycle, a podcast where we look at some of this year's elections, notably the elections in the United States, United Kingdom, and India, but not only. We want to remind you, first off, that you can subscribe to be a premium subscriber and get the entirety of this week's episode and all week's episodes at, what is it? It's tricycle.hubwave.net.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
We want to remind you that you can be a premium subscriber and get the entirety of this week's episode and indeed all week's episodes by going to tricycle.hubwave.net. I am here, as always, with Tom Hamilton.
Hello.
And Rohan Venkat.
Hello.
And we are not alone today. It's a very exciting episode because today we have a guest with us. Tom, will you tell us a bit more about our special guest?
Yes, absolutely. We're joined this week by Matthew McGregor, who is, I should say, disclaimer, a former colleague of mine back when I worked at the Labour Party in a period where both Matthew and I lost the same election in 2015, where Matthew worked on digital campaigns for Labour then. He's previously worked on digital campaigns for in America for the Barack Obama campaign, and I think other campaigns there too. And he's also CEO of 38 Degrees, which is a UK-based progressive campaigning organisation, which is does most of what it does is digital-based as well. So what we thought we'd do today is talk to Matthew a bit about how digital campaigning works in elections, particularly in the US and UK, which is where he's got the most experience. But clearly, it's an increasing factor around the world. When I first started working for the Labour Party quite a long time ago, we had a new media team, which was what the digital team was then called. I don't know when it got renamed, but in those days it really was just an afterthought to how election campaigns worked, and now it's really a critical part of it. Matthew, can we start with a really basic question, which is, what is digital campaigning and why is it important?
Well, it's tremendously important nowadays. Firstly, I should just say thank you massively for having me on. I'm an avid listener of the podcast so far, having worked in the three countries that you're talking about. So thanks for doing it and thanks for inviting me. Digital campaigning is important because digital is interwoven with all aspects of people's lives, and therefore campaigns need to be in those places as well. And I think we've talked about in recent years about the digital aspects of campaigns. Really, every aspect of campaigning is digital now. You've got broadcast campaigning, simply getting your message to voters in a mass audience way, requires digital communications. Persuading voters on a one-to-one basis, whether you're using apps on a doorstep or micro-targeted advertising online, requires digital communication, digital campaigning. Mobilizing your own supporters, firing up your base and persuading them to support the campaign requires digital campaigning. Media management, literally just working the media, working journalists, requires you to be on digital channels and to use digital channels to reach out to those journalists, sometimes in private, sometimes in public. Attack and rebuttal requires digital communications as a primary mechanism. And fundraising is a huge part of a lot of the campaigns that we work on, varying across countries, but increasingly important in Europe, following the trend in the States. So digital campaigning is important because it is the mechanism through which almost everything a campaign needs to do is carried.
I have a question. You mentioned that you have worked in all three of our countries, and I'm wondering if there are noticeable differences between the three. So, for example, one of the things that we've talked about on this podcast is that there's just so much more money in U.S. campaigns than there are in British campaigns. I guess I'm just curious, like what I can imagine that there are certain, not basics, but certain fundamentals that carry throughout. But are there ways in which what you just described varies wildly from country to country?
Yeah, I should caveat my previous comment. I only spent 8 days in India during the think it was 2014 election. So I wouldn't claim to be an expert, but some insights from there. And I've worked on general elections in Australia and referendums in Sweden and elsewhere, and there definitely are similarities that you can read across about how you communicate with people, and voters have similarities in all countries, right? And that will then read across to digital campaigning. But there are absolutely differences, and I would put them in three individual buckets: money, that you've touched on, law, and culture. So when it comes to money, I mean, I think lots of people who work in campaigns in Europe will have sat through a presentation from an American consultant. I have myself delivered some of those presentations. I don't sound like it, but I'm a dual UK-US citizen, so I'd probably count as an American consultant in some circumstances. I was once in a presentation, me and a friend from the Obama campaign, Mitch Stewart, presented to the leader of the German SPD and his colleagues. Mitch went first and talked about all of the amazing things that the Obama field team had done in 2012, and I was going to go second. After his presentation, the leader of the German SPD, I can't remember his name, he was one of the long list of losing candidates to Angela Merkel. He sat back very pensive and said, I've written down 13 recommendations you've given us, 8 of which are against the law in Germany. Do you have any other suggestions for me?
Right.
And, the legal difference between America and basically the rest of the world is really stark. America, to a great extent, is the Wild West when it comes to data, and data is a huge part of all campaigns. So that's one. Money is a really big difference. We've also sat through presentations from campaigns saying, we did this incredible, amazing thing. It was a game changer, and all that's required is $19 million, which would be the entirety of the whole of the Labour Party didn't spend $19 million in 2015. There's also a cultural difference. The United States is a much more polarized country where people's identities stack and they're less persuadable. It creates a huge amount of noise online, but I don't know how much persuasion is done there in a way that does happen in a lot of other countries. So I think it's not just money. There's also law and culture in there too.
Yeah. May I ask just one more before I let someone else have a chance, which is, I remember the Obama campaign was just so revolutionary in how it used digital media. And I remember the 4 more years tweet that somebody tweeted after he won re-election was like the most liked tweet ever. That campaign really figured out how to use social media at that time. It also feels like that was another world, both because I think in the years since, journalists became much more dependent on Twitter in many ways, right? I can remember, and also I think so did politicians. I can remember Kamala Harris in the 2020 primary debates asking a question about abortion, in part because people journalists on Twitter had been like, wow, nobody asked about abortion at the first debate, right? Like it just became much more in the water for all campaigns. And also at the same time, it feels like Twitter specifically, which is at least in the US, journalists' favorite social media outlet, is just not what it was in our post-Elon world. And Trump is on Truth Social and sort of doesn't have, and sort of the Trump ecosystem of Twitter is not really the same. And I guess my question is, since in the US specifically, since the Obama years, how do you see digital media as having changed in the US, though not only in the US?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, in a way, and to a great extent in 2012, it was a brave new world where I think a lot of progressives, me included, thought that we'd stumbled across a bunch of tools that we could use for good without giving a ton of thought to the fact that people could use them for ill as well. A tool is a tool. You can use a hammer to build something, or you can use a hammer to attack someone with it. And I think that we were probably a little naive, perhaps lazy. A lot of people didn't see Trump coming, so fair enough. I think there has been a change in the US and to a great extent in Europe as well over the last 5 or 6 years, which is a retreat from the public square, the internet as a public square, towards closed closed spaces for interacting online. The use of Facebook for politics, the use of Twitter for the media is much less prevalent than it was a few years ago. Whereas WhatsApp groups, Instagram DMs, and so on are much more significant. And I think that the Biden campaign talks about a digital strategy based around narrowcasting rather than broadcasting, seeking to try and reach people in the spaces where they are, even though you can't personally reach into those spaces. I think that to some extent draws on something that was really core to the Obama campaigns, which was the mobilization of supporters as trusted messengers in a world in which voters trust the media and politicians less and trust their friends and acquaintances more. I think that is even more. That was true to us in 2012 when we sought to mobilize our supporters to be messengers on our behalf in their own social networks. That was a smart tactic then. It's a required tactic now because of the retreat out of the public square into private spaces with friends and family. That's partly because of polarization. People don't want to argue. People don't want to deal with unpleasantness. Is partly because of the way in which some of those open platforms have monetized and used in other ways the ability to track what people are saying and so on. I think that is a significant change over the last few years that campaigns are having to grasp to get their heads around.
Back when you were working, as Emily mentioned on the Obama campaign, a lot of this was new, and one of the things that I've always wondered, and I'm curious to hear from you, is that from the outside, it can often seem like things are changing so radically from election to election, or every couple of years. There's so many new potential tactics and technologies. On your end, does it feel like it's constantly startup mode, or do you think over the last decade there's been a set of pretty clear, like, broad approaches to things on which you can iterate when new technologies come to the fore?
I think that the fundamentals are relatively stable in the sense that campaigns seek to broadcast their message, persuade, target voters, mobilize their activists, and so on. And there are a range of new tactics in which you can do that. And the goal of digital campaigns in the parties or for the candidates is to innovate quicker, to pick the winners amongst those tools. I got in some trouble in 2016 by joking on a platform that 2016 was going to be the Yik Yak election. And one reporter failed to pick up the sarcasm in my accent and reported it as a straight fact, which I've been absolutely rinsed by my friends about ever since. It's not going to be a Yik Yak election, but where should you put your money? In 2019, the Conservatives invested really heavily in YouTube. There are competitive advantages about where to spend your money. For example, Labour has traditionally spent more of its money in staff who then mobilize supporters and drive traffic organically, because with a lower budget than the Conservative Party tends to have, you can get a better ROI from organic than you can from paid. There are disadvantages to that. You can't target your persuadable voters in the same way, and that cost us quite dearly in 2015, but we simply didn't have the money. So I think the fundamentals are relatively stable. But where the advantages are gained is in picking winners, spending your money correctly, and just executing better. I think one other change I would say that you're starting to see and does create a competitive advantage, I think, is how integrated digital is into the broader campaign environment. So traditionally, people who run these campaigns will be party elders, for want of a better phrase. Not all of them are old per se, but they'll have been around a lot of the time. They will be close to politicians. They tend to come from a background of policy or fundraising or traditional communications, and quite often have not had a good sense of what works online. It's unusual to have younger people at the top table, and so campaigns where you can get the doors swung open, run clean, for Joe Biden has done this brilliantly well. The digital director at the Labour Party is now also a senior advisor to Keir Starmer and has a role at the top table. I think that kind of integration, how well does a campaign bring digital into the absolute core of the campaign's operations? That's another example of the kind of competitive advantage that campaigns should be looking for.
So speaking of picking winners then, between us, what are the winners for 2024?
Well, it's not going to be Yik Yak. I can exclusively reveal that now. I think when you think about the fundamental things that will make the most impact in this election, you have to differentiate between what will get the most media attention and what will actually make the most difference to campaigns. TikTok will obviously get a huge amount of attention. Doesn't mean it's going to move the needle the most when it comes to the things campaigns want to do, like persuade voters or pressure the media. Tom said before, I work for 38 Degrees. It's a digital campaigning organization with a community of almost 1 million people around the country. We campaign on economic justice, climate change. We have a range of innovative ways of doing our campaigning online, on social media. We're very active on TikTok and Instagram and so on. Almost all of our funding comes from our supporters chipping in small amounts of money, £8.82 on average each time they give. And 95% of that money comes from people clicking on a link in an email. Email is absolutely fundamental to our success as a campaigning organization. Email is not going to get any headlines. Email is not going to be interesting. But I'm sure I'm right in saying that the Biden campaign, which will raise almost half of its money from small donations, will get almost all of that money through emails to its supporters. So I think the next big thing is a lot of little things. It really is about how you get the mix right in an election and using the right tool for different tactics. Twitter is not a way to reach normal people. It is a useful tool. I use Twitter a lot. I don't want to be too down on it, even with its new owner. But it's a good way to reach the media and basically no one else. It's for extremely online people only. Doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. You need to use it in a way that is sensible. The investment you make should be sensible to the return you want.
On that, really quickly, do you feel, and I'm not blaming social media or digital media for the fact that Trump was president of the United States, but was there sort of a moment of taking stock after the 2016 election? Only because I ask this because, one, Trump through social media was so able to drive traditional media in a way that more traditional candidates could not. And two, famously, Hillary Clinton's campaign was very reliant on digital media and data and sort of the future, and not on things like getting on a plane and going to Michigan. So after that, was there we need to do a better job of not going all in on the new and in fact mixing it with the old? Or am I just blaming digital media too much for my country's fate?
I wouldn't say it's the fault of digital media. I think that campaigns can make bad decisions. Campaigns made bad decisions before digital media turned up. It's just a whole range of new ways in which you can make bad decisions. And I do think there was a huge amount of self-reflection from the Clinton campaign. I mean, I know many of the people some of the people who ran the Clinton campaign, and I know they will reflect on decisions they made for many years to come yet. And I think that a lot of people in the Democratic Party and progressive campaigns around the world have spent a lot of time trying to analyze what happened that allowed Trump in. I don't necessarily think that same level of self-reflection has taken place in the media, and the role in which Trump refusing to abide by the normal rules of the game and by using his special superpower of total shamelessness to get around those rules was not dealt with by the media then, and I think still has not been dealt with. Trump fell asleep at a trial of his crimes yesterday, and there's been no media coverage of that. I think if Biden fell asleep in a really significant moment in his career, the media would have treated it extremely differently. Trump is essentially playing on easy mode in the way that I think the Conservatives can do so in the UK. So yes, digital media, we do have some reflecting to do, and a lack of perspective about the ability to use digital media for ill as well as for good has cost us, as I mentioned earlier. But I think traditional media and campaign decision makers also have a role in that wasn't necessarily driven by the digital media environment. It was driven by them making bad decisions.
I just want to say I completely agree with you on media not reflecting generally. Like, we still have the Chirons, saying like Trump says a zany thing. But I do want to note that we know that Trump fell asleep in part because Maggie Haberman of the New York Times live blogged it. So it's not that there was no media coverage, but I agree with you in that there's a different standard, and it's both that Trump takes all the oxygen out of the room and that the oxygen or that the room is like an odd shape, right? Like he's so focused on, and yet the focus is not, in my opinion, on the really important things. So anyway.
One of the things that's true of digital campaigning that's not really true of almost anything else that political parties do is you can be quite sure quite quickly of how well it's doing. You can measure lots of it in ways that you can't measure the effectiveness of a politician's speech in the same way that you can know very quickly whether this way of writing an email is better than that way of writing an email. It's the only bit of politics that does A/B testing, really, because the only bit of politics that realistically can do A/B testing. Do you think, where am I going with this question? Do you think that that leads people to sort of over-index on digital just because they can measure it, in the same way that people are sometimes tempted to spend more time on Twitter than they should because they can count the retweets? Or is it what? Is it really absolutely critical to get that right, and therefore to focus on the measurable stuff?
I feel very seen by that Twitter comment, Tom. Honest answer is I don't know. I mean, I think different campaigns will make different decisions, but I think there's something to that there has been, especially since 2012, and the kind of, I don't want to say mythologizing of the Obama campaign, because a lot of it was true, but the focus on the Obama campaign's use of data has driven that determination to measure everything a long way. I think measuring things is a really good idea. Understanding what works and what doesn't work is a really good idea. Quite a lot of the time, the thing you're measuring is the operationalization rather than the strategy. You're able to measure the success of the tactic rather than the bigger picture. And I think that, one of a phrase I use with my team to, so often that they make fun of me for it, is we have to look out of the window. You can't just look at the dashboard in front of you. You also have to look out the window. We are smart people on the whole, and we are experienced, and we have good judgment and intuition. And I think that one of the risks is that the data that you can see stops you from going with your judgment sometimes. Not necessarily with your gut, but with your judgment. There's a difference between the two things. And data cannot cover everything. Data cannot cover the biggest picture. It can only cover the operationalization of your tactics day by day. So we as a team make decisions about what emails go out and what tactics we're using based on the results we get from tests of small slices of the list. But that doesn't tell us what big picture political decisions we should be making, or whether we should be attacking this politician or launching this campaign. Sometimes you have to go with your judgment. You have to look out the window and make a call based on your experience. So I do think it can definitely be
one of the things
risk.
that really struck me when I first started working with your team, actually, because you mentioned earlier about old-fashioned policy people and other party people who get involved in the digital side of campaigns. I never ran the digital campaign, but I was sort of part of the interface with the digital campaign. And one of the things I was really struck by was, I naively still thought of social media as just a place to make jokes which would get engagement. And you were relentlessly focused. Your team was relentlessly focused on just building lists of supporters, getting more and more people signed up to things, making more and more money from small donations. And it was almost it was an industrial systematic process that wasn't really matched by the bit of the party that I was in, even if it was matched by, say, the field team who were considering where best to target resources in terms of which seats to target. But yeah, the data-driven nature of the digital operation was a real sort of eye opener for me when I started. I started working on it, and yeah, email still is sort of the bread and butter of this stuff, isn't it? I mean, even now,
email is the bread and butter of a lot of campaign to highly engaged activists communication. It is a platform that the campaign can own. You know, Meta can decide one day that they're going to completely change the terms of service of WhatsApp and completely ruin your entire program. So email is strong in that you can own it. Email is strong in that you can communicate a large amount of information, relatively speaking, very directly. And you can tailor that information to what you know about the supporter based on what they've done. I always say you learn something from every email you send somebody, even if the thing you've learned is that they haven't opened it. So you can tailor the emails that you send to people. I think it's important to emphasize that people that sign up for political campaigns email lists and then open and engage with those emails are activists. So it is a slice of your audience, an important slice of your audience. But there are other important things to a digital campaign. The broadcast, the persuasion, going back to one of the things that Rohan talked about earlier in terms of competitive advantage. I thought the Biden campaign was very, very smart at how they used social listening and audience testing to determine which attacks on Joe Biden worked and what messages countered those arguments. Sasha Eisenberg, who wrote a brilliant book about the 2012 campaign, has a new book out soon called The Lie Detectives that includes this vignette in it. And they relentlessly search for the attacks on Joe Biden, put them in front of polls and focus groups, and then ensured that the messages that worked showed up when people were searching for those terms. And that's a great example of, SEO is not going to get headlines in an election write-up about how did we win this election. But I think that was a vital part of the 2012 campaign, and I think given all of the vulnerabilities that Biden has in this campaign, will be a vital part of their armory this time around too.
We spoke a couple of weeks ago with a reporter from India who covered some of the seedier sides of the digital political world. Some of it more, upfront in terms of using influencers to get messages out going around the traditional media, but also, troll farms and AI and so on. And we can't have like a discussion in 2024 without touching upon on AI. But what I want to ask is almost an extension of what I asked you before, whether like it's settled into a reasonable state, which is, does it feel overwhelming for you to have to combat the dirty side of the potential campaigning space, or is it now, you know what to expect out there and you know what has to be done?
I whenever I talk about digital campaigning, I quite like getting asked, how do we solve disinformation? Because it's a really easy one to answer. I don't know. I really don't know. And I think it's a challenge that is way beyond the realms of campaigns. It's something that governments and tech companies need to be thinking about much more seriously. And I think we can say that comprehensively, the UK, the US, and to a lesser extent, but still include them, the EU, are failing to adapt to the threat. I mean, there have been countless efforts at malign disinformation. Just in the last week, with the stuff about the Sydney stabbing attack, has been some of the misinformation and disinformation has been tracked back to Russian operatives. It's not within the realms of campaigns to fix that kind of stuff, because it's about the real fundamentals of the internet in the 2020s. I think campaigns are going to try and find ways in which they can mitigate and combat some of some of the outcomes. You saw this with, I thought Labour were very good to counter a deep fake audio recording of Keir Starmer apparently berating his staff that was AI generated. Very quick on that. Very quick to get to the media, instantly trying to rebut that and to highlight the fake nature of it. But that is all mitigation. To get to the source of some of these problems is beyond the realms of any.
And not every campaign on this, we should say, is equal, by which I mean that some are trying to mitigate disinformation and others are actively spreading it, right? Like in the United States, I think we should really disabuse ourselves of the notion that the big threat from disinformation is from Russia, when it's being actively spread by one of the campaigns of one of our two major parties. Okay, I think we have to let you go, but I did want to ask, speaking of disinformation, if Tom and Rohan, you don't mind if I take the last one, what is one misconception about digital campaigning that you would like to clear up today for our listeners?
Yeah, I think the first one I would go to is that digital campaign staff do not know how to fix printers. Talk to the IT team.
Matthew, thanks very much for joining us today. That is, I think, the end of our normally scheduled programming for the day. But if you stick around and if you have signed up for our premium section via tricycle.hubwave.net, that is right, isn't it? I don't have it written down. I did it from memory. Tricycle.hubwave.net. Then there are various extras available, which this week includes, I think, a potted profile of Angela Rayner and at least one audience question. So if you want to hear that, you've got to pay extra, but it's well worth it. For the rest of you, thank you and goodbye.